My husband wasn't even cold in the ground before my own son started moving his money. I didn't know, but our housekeeper did, and she waited 3 days before she worked up the courage to tell me. Those 3 days changed everything. Before I tell you what my son did, and I am going to tell you every single detail, I need you to understand one thing. I am not a dramatic woman. I have never been the kind of person who uses words like betrayal or devastated in casual conversation. I was a school librarian for 22 years. I make my bed every morning. I send birthday cards on time. I am, by every reasonable measure, an ordinary 63-year-old woman who had an ordinary life. And that is exactly what they were counting on. They were counting on me being too grieved to look closely, too trusting to ask questions, too old maybe to fight back. They were counting on the fact that when a woman buries her husband of 38 years, she is so consumed by loss that she won't notice what's being taken from her the very same moment. They were almost right. Here is what I want you to know before we begin. At the end of this story, I am still standing. I got my money back. I got my house back. I got my name back. And the person who thought he could walk into my grief and use it as a door, he found out what happens when a woman who has nothing left to lose decides she is done being quiet. But none of that happened because I was brave. It happened because of a woman named Rosie Acaffer, who had worked in my house for 11 years, who could have said nothing and kept her job and her peace, and who chose instead to slide a folded piece of notepaper across my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening at 6:12 p.m. and say the words that changed everything. Stay with me. Every single part of this matters. And if this story touches something in you, if it reminds you of someone you know, or something you've been through, or a voice in your gut you've been ignoring, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. This story is for you. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. My husband wasn't even cold in the ground before my own son started moving his money. I didn't know, but our housekeeper did, and she waited 3 days before she worked up the courage to tell me. Those 3 days changed everything. My name is Carol Whitfield. I'm 63 years old, and until 14 months ago, I genuinely believed I had a good life. I believed I had a loving son, a loyal family, and a marriage that, while not perfect, was built on something real. 38 years of something real. I believed that when the hard times came, the people around me would hold me up. I believed that grief was the worst thing I would feel in the weeks after I buried my husband of nearly 4 decades. I was wrong about all of it. I want to start at the beginning, because nothing about this story makes sense if you jump in the middle. And because the beginning is where the seeds of everything were planted, long before I had the eyes to see them growing. Gerald Whitfield was 67 when he died. Heart attack. Fast, the doctors said, which was supposed to be a comfort, and in some ways it was. He didn't suffer. He was here, and then he wasn't. We'd had a normal Wednesday. Scrambled eggs in the morning. He kissed me on the cheek before his afternoon walk. He said, "I'll be back in 45 minutes. He wasn't. Mrs. Acaffer, our housekeeper of 11 years, found him in the backyard when she went to call him in for dinner. He'd made it to the garden bench, his favorite spot in the entire world, the one with a broken slat he'd kept meaning to fix for 3 summers, and that was where he stopped. Sitting upright, head slightly bowed, like he'd fallen asleep in a pleasant place, which I suppose, if there is any mercy in the universe, he had. I didn't cry right away. I remember that clearly. I sat on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working, and I just held his hand, which was already cool, and I talked to him. I told him he couldn't do this to me. I told him we had a trip planned for the fall. We were finally going to see the coast of Maine, something we'd been promising ourselves for 20 years. I told him I hadn't finished reading the book we were reading together. It was one of those thick historical novels, the kind with the soft cover that gets bent at every chapter you pause on, and we were only halfway through. I told him that wasn't fair. He couldn't leave me in the middle of the story. Mrs. Acaffer sat on the floor beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to move me or comfort me with words. She just sat there, close enough that our shoulders were nearly touching, and she stayed. The paramedics came and still she stayed. She was the last person who left the house that night, after everyone else, and she was the first one back the next morning. I want you to remember that. It will matter. Our son, Marcus, arrived within the hour that first night. He lived 40 minutes away in the city, and he drove fast when I called him, which told me something in him still loved his father. He held me in the kitchen doorway, and I felt him shake, which broke me completely in a way I hadn't been broken yet. We stood there for a long time. Long enough for the sun to go all the way down, and the kitchen to go dark, and neither of us to think about turning on a light. I want you to hold onto that image too. Marcus shaking in the doorway, grieving his father. Because that was real. I still believe it was real. What happened after? I think what happened after was something that had been quietly planned for much longer than any of it should have been. And the grief was genuine even as the other thing was already in motion. People are complicated in ways that should terrify us more than they do. They can grieve and scheme at the same time. They can love you and still take from you. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Most days I think it makes it worse. Marcus was our only child. We tried for more. It wasn't in the cards. Gerald always said Marcus was enough, more than enough, and he wasn't wrong. Marcus was bright and driven and charming, the kind of son people brag about at dinner parties and mean it. He built his own financial consulting business from nearly nothing in his early 30s, leveraging a combination of genuine intelligence and a talent for making people feel understood in exactly the moments they were most vulnerable to financial decision-making. He was good at his work. He was good at reading people. I know that now in a way I didn't know it then. By the time Gerald died, Marcus was doing well enough financially that I'd never worried about him. That was a mistake. Comfort is its own kind of blindness. The funeral arrangements fell to me and Marcus together, with Rosie quietly handling the parts of the house that needed handling, so neither of us had to think about them. I was grateful for that, grateful that I didn't have to navigate the loss and the logistics entirely alone. Marcus was efficient about it, in a way that Gerald would have appreciated. Gerald hated waste and fuss. Marcus made decisions cleanly, communicated with the funeral home without drama, kept things dignified and spare and simple. I watched my son move through those days and I thought, whatever else, he is a good man. He really is. There was a woman with him most of those days. Her name was Danny, short for Danielle. She was 34, 9 years younger than Marcus, 29 years younger than me, and she had one of those faces that is beautiful in an architectural way. Very symmetrical, very composed, with the kind of bone structure that photographs dramatically and expresses very little. Marcus had mentioned her over the previous year, but casually. A colleague, someone I'd been seeing, nothing serious. The last time I'd asked directly, maybe 5 months before Gerald died, Marcus had shrugged it off. We're just enjoying things, Mom. No pressure. So I was surprised to see how present she was. How much at home she seemed in my house during those days. She moved through the kitchen like she knew where everything was. The good tea, the serving trays, where we kept the extra napkins, which she shouldn't have known because we'd only met twice. She answered the door when people came to pay their respects. She arranged the food platters without being asked. She touched Marcus's arm in a way that read as territorial rather than comforting. A small proprietary gesture, the kind a person makes when they want the room to understand something about ownership. Though I told myself I was probably imagining that. I was grieving. Grieving people see things through a strange and distorting lens. Mrs. Aucaffer watched her too. I noticed that. Mrs. Aucaffer is the kind of woman who keeps her thoughts sealed behind a professional expression, unless she's decided you deserve to know them. She'd come to us when Marcus was in his early 30s. A referral from a neighbor, impeccably reliable, possessed of a dignity so complete, it made you want to behave better simply by proximity. In 11 years, she'd only lowered that professional expression for me a handful of times, usually to deliver a small corrective thing. Mr. Gerald prefers his coffee without that creamer, Mom. Always with enough diplomacy that you couldn't take offense. She was watching Danny the way a doctor watches a patient who is describing the wrong symptoms. like something wasn't adding up. Like the story being presented didn't match the evidence she was quietly collecting. I filed that away. I was busy filing things away in those days, storing observations in some back room of my mind to be sorted later, when there was less happening. There is so much administrative emotion during grief. So many things that arrive demanding your attention while the real thing, the actual loss, quietly grows larger and heavier in the center of your chest. You deal with the casseroles and the flowers and the distant relatives who call at inconvenient hours because they mean well and timing isn't their gift. You make decisions about burial plots and headstones and whether the reception should have wine. Gerald would have wanted wine. So yes, wine. And the real grief does its slow work in the spaces between all of that. At 3 a.m. when the house is still, and the other half of the bed is a fact you don't know how to absorb. I want to pause here for just a moment, because what I'm about to tell you next, what I found 3 days after the funeral, is the part of this story that I've had to tell more than once now, to lawyers and to investigators and to people who love me, and it never gets easier to say out loud. But I want you to hear it the way I experienced it. Not as something dramatic, not as a scene from a movie, but as something that happened quietly in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening, with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking and a woman in a coat who could have just said goodnight and meant it. Because the most important moments in our lives almost never arrive with music. They arrive the way Rosie arrived. Quietly at 6:12, coat already on, hands folded, choosing her words like she was picking her way across wet stones. Keep listening. This is where everything changes. Gerald had a will. Of course he did. He was meticulous about financial matters, almost compulsively so, in the way of a man who grew up without money and never entirely stopped being afraid of what that felt like. He'd updated his will when Marcus started his business, and again when he turned 65. Our estate attorney, a man named Harold Fitch who had been Gerald's closest friend since their college years, had a copy on file, and the original was in the fireproof safe in Gerald's study. I knew all of this. I'd sat beside Gerald when the documents were signed. I knew what was in it. Or I thought I knew. What I knew, what I believed with total confidence, was that Gerald had divided things simply and cleanly. The house to me outright. A significant investment portfolio, split between me and Marcus in proportions that reflected both fairness and his understanding of what each of us would need. A smaller sum set aside in a trust for any future grandchildren. Some charitable donations to Gerald's pet causes, a local library endowment, because Gerald had loved libraries his whole life and had once said a library was the most democratic institution a community could have. A scholarship fund at his alma mater for students who reminded him of himself at 18. None of it was complicated. None of it was surprising. Gerald was not a complicated man when it came to what mattered to him. What I did not know, what none of us knew I would later understand, was that a second document existed. I first heard something was wrong not from a lawyer. Not from Marcus. Not from any official source or formal notification. I heard it from Mrs. Housekeeper. It was 3 days after the funeral. The last of the visitors had finally gone. Marcus and Danny had stayed through the reception and then left together in his car, which I'd expected. The house was quiet in that horrible particular way houses go quiet after a death. Not peaceful quiet, but a loudness of silence that presses against you. That makes you aware of every room that used to have a different kind of air in it. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, looking at the spot on the counter where Gerald always left his glasses, which someone had moved and put away, and I was trying to decide whether to be angry about that or not. Mrs. Housekeeper came and stood in the doorway. She had her coat on already. She always left at 6. It was 6:12. "Mrs. Carroll," she said. "Can I speak with you?" Her voice was so careful. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. In 11 years, Mrs. Housekeeper had never sounded careful with me. She sounded competent, warm, occasionally firm when firmness was needed. Never careful. Careful meant she was about to say something she wasn't certain I could handle, and she decided to say it anyway. I set down my tea. "Of course, Rosie, sit down." She didn't sit. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, which was another tell, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before in 11 years. It was the expression of someone who has been wrestling with a decision for days and has finally made it, and is not glad about making it, but has made it anyway because they are the kind of person who does the right thing even when the right thing is not comfortable. "I don't know if this is my business," she began. And I thought hard about whether to say anything. "You have enough pain right now, more than enough. But I decided that you having more pain now is better than what might happen if you don't know. And I decided that you would want to know, even if it's hard. I think you would want to know." I remember hearing my own heartbeat in that moment. Not fast, just present. The way you suddenly become aware of something your body does automatically, all day, every day, that you never normally notice. "Tell me," I said. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, not a document, just a piece of lined notepaper, the kind you pull from a grocery list pad, with handwriting on it in her careful, precise script. She set it on the table in front of me. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I was cleaning Mr. Gerald's study. He was out. You were at your sister's for the day. I was dusting the bookshelves and I knocked over a folder that was sitting on the corner of the desk. It wasn't filed. It was just sitting there, loose, like it had been set down recently and not put away. Papers fell out. I picked them up." She paused. She was choosing every word. "I'm not a lawyer. I didn't understand all of it, but I understand enough. There were pages that looked like a will amendment, an addendum, I think is the word. And there was a name on it that I didn't expect to see." She tapped the notepad gently. "I wrote down what I could remember. I should have said something sooner. I was afraid of causing trouble, of being wrong, I don't know. I was afraid. But then Mr. Gerald died, and every morning since then I woke up thinking, she needs to know. Mrs. Carroll needs to know." I looked at the notepad. She had written in her careful script, "Amendment to last will and testament, GW, mentions Danny L. Rourke, investment accounts. Transfer authorization, Marcus W., listed as executor with broad discretionary power. Date, approx. 8 months ago." I read it 3 times. Each time, a different part of it settled differently into my understanding, like stones dropping into still water one at a time. Danny L. Rourke. Danny. Investment accounts. Transfer authorization. 8 months ago. Which was 4 months before Gerald died. Which meant Gerald had still been alive when this was drawn up. Which meant, and this was where my brain started to go very white and very still around the edges, either Gerald had done this himself, for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, or someone had influenced him to do it. And if Gerald had done this himself, why had he never mentioned a single word of it to me? To me, his wife of 38 years, the woman he kissed on the cheek every single morning. And if someone had influenced him, if Marcus had been the one to arrange this, to take his aging father to some unknown attorney and put a pen in his hand. I looked up at Mrs. Aucaffer. "You're certain about the name?" I asked. My voice sounded like it was coming from a different room. "Danny L. Rourke," she said. I checked the spelling twice before I wrote it. I wrote it down in the car immediately before I could forget. I nodded. My hands were flat on the table, completely still. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. I'd expected my whole body to shake. But they were utterly still, the way water goes still in the moment before it freezes, when it stops being water and becomes something else. "Thank you, Rosie," I said. "Thank you for telling me." "What will you do?" she asked. "I'm going to find out what's in that safe," I said. "And then I'm going to call Harold Fitch." She nodded slowly. She looked at me for a long moment with something that was close to grief. Not grief for Gerald, but for me, for the woman she could see was about to learn something that would rearrange everything she thought she knew about her own life. Then she said good night, and she left. I sat at the kitchen table, and I listened to the sound of her car starting in the driveway. I listened to it pull out. I listened to it get quiet. Then I got up and I walked to Gerald's study. The safe was behind a panel in the closet, Gerald's version of clever, which every member of the family had known about for years, and which rather defeated the purpose. but we'd always had more faith than sense when it came to trusting each other. That thought hit me with a particular sharpness as I opened the panel. More faith than sense. All of us. All our lives. I knew the combination. I'd known it for 30 years. 4 numbers that I could dial in the dark, which I had done once, years ago, when the power went out and Gerald needed a document he'd left there. The safe opened with a soft, satisfying clunk. Inside, the original will exactly where it had always been, in its blue folder. Insurance documents. Property deeds. Gerald's passport, even though he'd never been comfortable on planes, and we'd done most of our traveling by car. A small envelope of cash, $400, that he'd kept for emergencies ever since an ice storm knocked out power and the ATMs for 4 days in 2011, and he'd sworn he would never be caught without cash again. And a second folder, slimmer than the first, newer looking. The kind of folder you get from an office supply store, not the kind Gerald's law firm used. Unremarkable in every way except for the fact that it didn't belong here, in this safe, in this house, in this version of my life that I thought I understood. I took it to the desk. I sat down in Gerald's chair, which I had not done since he died because it still smelled like him, and I opened the folder under the lamp. Harold Fitch called it a codicil when I reached him the next morning. A formal amendment to the will, executed 8 months before Gerald died, notarized and legally valid on its face as far as he could determine from my description. He hadn't prepared it. That was the first thing he said, and I could hear in his voice how deeply that bothered him, not just professionally but personally, because Harold had handled every legal matter Gerald Whitfield had touched for 40 years, and the fact that something this significant had been drafted without his knowledge was not a small thing. "Someone else drew this up," he said. "Do you have the letterhead?" I read it to him. He didn't recognize the firm. I read him the relevant sections of the codicil over the phone. My voice stayed steady throughout. I have no explanation for that, except that perhaps the body has its own kind of intelligence, and mine had decided that steadiness was what the moment required. The codicil did several things, all of them clean and purposeful. It named Marcus as sole executor with what the language called broad discretionary authority over the investment portfolio, removing the co-executor clause that had been in the original will, which had named Harold himself. It authorized Marcus to make transfer decisions regarding the portfolio without requiring sign-off from any additional trustee or co-executor. And it included a provision, buried in the 3rd page, written in the most anodyne, bureaucratic legal language I have ever encountered. The kind of language designed to be skipped over rather than read, establishing a financial interest for one Danielle Marie Rourke in the event that Marcus exercised his discretion to establish a jointly held investment vehicle. In plain English, Marcus could move the money, and when he moved it, Danny could have a legal share of it, with my dead husband's signature authorizing every bit of it. "Carol." Harold's voice was very quiet. "How much of the portfolio are we talking about?" I told him the number I'd seen on the most recent statement, which Gerald had always left accessible in his top drawer because he liked to look at it. There was a long pause. "I need you to come to my office," Harold said. "Today, if you can manage it, and I need you to bring that document." I went that afternoon. I brought the codicil in its unremarkable store-bought folder. I also brought Mrs. Ockhafer's notepad, the grocery list paper with her careful handwriting, because I had learned in 50-some years of being alive that witnesses matter and documentation matters, and you never know which small thing will turn out to be the thing that saves you. I'm going to tell you what Harold said in that meeting. I'm going to tell you about the phone call I got the next morning from my own son, the message he left while I was already sitting across from Harold Fitch, learning exactly what Marcus had put in motion. And I'm going to tell you about what I found in Gerald's private calendar that made me sit down on the floor of his study for the second time in 2 weeks. But first I need to tell you something, because I think about this a lot. 3 weeks had passed between the day Rosie found those papers and the day she told me. 3 weeks. I've asked her about those 3 weeks. I've asked her what was going through her mind. She told me she went back and forth every day, Some days convinced it wasn't her place. Some days lying awake at 3 in the morning certain she had to speak. She told me that what finally decided her wasn't courage, exactly. It was math. She did the math of what would happen to me if she stayed quiet versus what would happen to me if she spoke. And she decided that me being hurt by the truth, now, was a smaller number than me being destroyed by a lie later. I think about that math a lot. I think about all the times in my life I've chosen not to say the hard thing because it felt like it wasn't my place. I think about how many people might be sitting in kitchens right now, waiting for someone to do the math. Okay. Back to Harold's office. Harold met me in the same office where Gerald and I had sat together 20 years earlier to do our original estate planning. The same worn leather chairs. The same law books on the shelves that probably hadn't been opened since digital research became standard. But Harold kept them because Gerald had always admired them, had always said walking into a room full of books made a man feel like serious thinking was possible. Harold himself was 71, trim and precise, with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that age had made more authoritative rather than less. He was one of those men who seemed to grow into himself as he got older, more present, more certain of what mattered. He had been Gerald's friend since they were 19 years old, and sitting across from him in that office without Gerald present felt like one of the stranger losses of those weeks, because Harold was one of the last places Gerald still existed in the present tense. He read the codicil slowly and carefully, twice, the way lawyers read things, attending to each clause rather than the overall impression. He made no expression I could read during any of it. Then he set it down, aligned it neatly with the edge of the desk in a gesture that was entirely automatic, and looked at me. Do you know if Gerald had any contact with this law firm? He pointed to the letterhead on the codicil. No, I said. I'd never heard the name before last night. MMM. He wrote something in his notepad. Carol, I have to ask you something directly, and I want you to understand that I'm not implying anything. I'm just trying to build the clearest possible picture. Did Gerald ever mention wanting to make changes to your estate plan in the last year or so? Any conversations about the investment accounts? About Danielle Rourke specifically? Never, I said. Not once, not a word. Did he seem? Harold paused, choosing. Did he seem fully himself in the last year? Any concerns about his cognitive state, his memory, his judgment? Anything that struck you as different? And that was when I started to cry. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because I did. In the last year of Gerald's life, he had not been fully himself. I had known it and not named it, the way you don't name things you're not ready to face. He'd become quieter than his nature, more deferential to Marcus in conversations and decisions that had always, before, been things Gerald handled with quiet authority. He'd had small spells of confusion, nothing alarming in isolation, nothing that triggered alarms when it happened, but a pattern I could see now, a clear pattern across those 12 months that I had filed away in that same back room of my mind, where I was storing all the observations I wasn't ready to sort. At least twice I had found him sitting at his desk, staring at papers with an expression I could not decode. I'd asked what he was reading. He'd said, nothing, just paperwork. And he'd gathered the papers quickly and changed the subject. I had not pushed. Gerald had a particular quality when he didn't want to be pushed, a kind of gentle deflection that I had always. I see this now, sitting in Harold's office with the codicil between us. I had always let work on me. Because he was Gerald. Because I trusted him. Because 38 years of trust is a powerful and sometimes dangerous thing. I had not called a doctor. Gerald had, on the one occasion I'd raised it, looked at me with such quiet certainty. I'm fine, Carol, I'm just tired. That I had let it go. I had not pushed hard enough. That is a sentence I have had to make peace with. I told Harold all of this. He listened without writing anything down. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Carol, I think we need to contest this document. And I think we need to act quickly, because if Marcus has already been exercising this executor authority. Has he? I asked. I had not let myself ask that question until this moment. Harold was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. I made some calls this morning, he said finally. Yes, 2 significant transfers were initiated in the last week, both to an account I don't have on record. I heard that the way you hear something in a dream, like the sound is reaching you through water, like it's traveling too slowly to land with its full weight. I sat with it for a moment. Just sat with it. How much? I asked. He told me. The amount was not everything. That was the only grace in it, a third roughly. Significant. Very significant. But not the whole of it. And what remained was still in accounts that could be frozen once a legal challenge was filed. Harold made calls before I left his office. He moved fast. That had always been the best thing about Harold, that when it mattered, he moved without hesitating. I drove home in a state I can only describe as very, very calm. Dangerously calm. The kind of calm that descends when emotion exceeds what the body can process, and the system simply stops, holds, waits for information it can use. I went to bed at 8 o'clock and slept for 9 hours, which was the most sleep I'd gotten since Gerald died, which felt perverse and also exactly right. Marcus called the next morning. He'd been calling every morning since the funeral, a ritual I had found genuinely comforting, something warm to anchor each day to. I had looked forward to those calls. That morning, when his name appeared on my phone, I let it ring. His voicemail said, "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up? Listen, I need to talk to you about some of Dad's accounts when you get a minute. Just estate stuff, nothing to worry about. Call me back when you can." Nothing to worry about. I sat with my phone in both hands and I read those words in his voice. The same voice he'd had at 7 years old, at 17, at the door of the kitchen, shaking with grief that was real. I sat with it for a long time. Then I called Harold. "He's making his move," I said. "I thought he might," Harold said. "Don't call him back yet. Let me file the challenge first. Once it's filed, he's on legal notice, and any transfers he makes after that point become significantly more problematic for him. Give me until end of day." "Okay," I said. "Carol, you're doing the right thing." "I know," I said. Which was true. And also made no difference to how it felt. I spent that day doing something I hadn't expected to do. I went through Gerald's things. Not to grieve, though there was grief threaded through everything unavoidably, but to look. To see what was actually there, now that I was looking at it with different eyes. I went through his desk, his files, his email, which I had the password to because we had always shared everything, which now had a terrible irony to it. And finally, his calendar. The calendar was where I stopped. I sat down on the floor of his study. Over the 18 months before his death, Gerald had met with Marcus on 17 occasions that were not reflected in our shared family calendar. The calendar I saw. Lunches. Coffee meetings. One Saturday that Gerald had told me was a business golf round with an old colleague, whose name he'd mentioned, and I hadn't questioned. 17 meetings I hadn't known about, hadn't asked about, hadn't had any reason to wonder about because Gerald was Gerald and Gerald didn't lie to me. On 8 of those 17 dates, there was a second entry below Marcus's name. Just 2 initials. Dr. Danny had been present at 8 of those meetings. I stayed on the floor for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift across the study floor from one angle to another. Long enough to feel, very completely, what it is to realize that a life you believed you knew had a room in it you'd never been shown. I know what you're wondering right now. I know because it's what I wondered, sitting on that floor, for every minute I sat there. Did Gerald know? Did my husband, who kissed me every morning, who had been reading that book with me 1 chapter at a time, who fixed a leaky faucet 2 weeks before he died, and left a note on the bathroom mirror about what he'd done because he wanted me to know the house was looked after. Did he know what he was signing? Did he understand what Marcus had arranged? I'm going to tell you the answer. It's not simple. Honest answers rarely are. But I'm going to tell you everything I came to understand in the 11 months that followed. What the investigators found, what the experts said, what Marcus's own attorney eventually had to concede in the settlement process. And I'm going to tell you about the moment, the one specific moment in all of this, That, I think, was the truest thing I learned about my son. Keep listening. We're in the middle of it now. I'm not going to tell you I understood everything on that study floor, because I didn't. I still don't entirely. What I believe, what Harold and I and eventually a forensic accountant and a second estate litigation attorney came to believe, after 11 months of careful and sometimes brutal investigation, was that Marcus had worked on his father gradually and with patience over those 18 months. 17 meetings. 8 of them with Danny present, probably because Danny was the kind of person who made complicated things feel reasonable simply by the way she held herself in a room. Gerald had loved Marcus profoundly, maybe more than he'd been wise to love anyone, because profound love always carries the risk of the wrong kind of trust. And Gerald had been aging in ways I hadn't acknowledged, becoming more susceptible than I'd understood to the influence of someone he trusted completely. Someone who knew exactly the right language, streamlining the estate, simplifying the structure, protecting the assets from tax exposure. Gerald would have responded to that language. Gerald had always trusted Marcus with financial things, because Marcus was the financial expert, and Gerald, for all his meticulousness, had always deferred to the expert in the room. I don't think Marcus told his father the full truth of what he was arranging. I think he told Gerald a version of it that felt, in the moment, like sound planning. I think he presented the codicil as something logical, something protective, something that a smart man would do for his family. I think Gerald, by the time he signed it, believed he was being responsible. But I can't be certain of that. And I have had to learn to live with the uncertainty, because the alternative, the possibility that Gerald understood completely and chose not to tell me, is a door I have opened and closed many times in the past year, and I don't yet know which side of it I'll land on when I finally decide to stop moving it. What I know is what Marcus did after his father died, and what he did after cannot be explained by love, or by grief, or by any story that has a version of Marcus as a complicated but ultimately good man in it. The morning calls that felt like comfort were monitoring. The efficiency during the funeral was not just filial duty. It was proximity to the process. The woman who moved through my kitchen like she owned it had, in some legal sense he'd arranged, a claim on something that belonged to me. What he did was calculated, and he thought I was too buried in grief to see it. The legal challenge took 11 months. I won't walk you through all of it, because some of it was boring in the way legal processes are boring. Filings and responses and depositions and continuances and procedural motions that exist to slow things down. And some of it was painful in ways I don't have words clean enough to describe. I will tell you the shape of it. Harold located the attorney who had drafted the codicil, a small estate planning practice in a suburb that Marcus had evidently chosen for its distance from our usual circles, in a zip code where no one would recognize the name Whitfield or think to mention a client meeting to someone we knew. When Harold's investigator spoke with that attorney, the attorney was, cooperative is the word. Cooperative in the way that people become cooperative when they realize they may have been a tool in something they didn't fully understand. He had met with Gerald once. Just once. Marcus had brought him. Gerald had asked no questions and had signed where indicated. The attorney had noted internally at the time that Gerald seemed quiet and deferential to his son, and had attributed this to normal family dynamics. An older man, a capable adult child, the kind of meeting where the child handles the complexity and the parent nods. In retrospect, the attorney said, he might have asked more questions. He might have insisted on meeting with Gerald separately. Might have, I said, when Harold told me this. Harold nodded. He'd heard the words with the same quiet fury I had. I've requested a full written account. A geriatric psychiatrist, an expert in cognitive assessment whom Harold knew through his professional network, reviewed Gerald's medical records from the 18 months in question. Her opinion was careful. She did not overclaim, did not make statements she couldn't support. But her conclusion was clear enough. Gerald had been in the early stages of cognitive decline during the period the codicil was signed. Not severe. Not the kind of thing that would have been visible to a casual observer. But enough enough to meaningfully compromise his ability to independently evaluate complex legal documents, especially under the influence of a trusted authority figure, presenting those documents as routine, enough to support a legal challenge on grounds of undue influence. Marcus hired an expensive defense attorney. That told me he was frightened, because Marcus was careful with money in ways that sometimes crossed into something smaller than care. He also stopped calling me, completely without explanation. The morning calls simply ceased, the day after Harold filed our challenge. I understood then what I'd already suspected, that those calls had never been purely love. They'd been surveillance. He'd been calling to hear what I knew. I missed them anyway. That is the most honestly pathetic thing I will say in this entire story. I missed my son's morning calls, knowing full well what they had been covering. I missed the voice. I missed the fiction of the version of my family those calls had let me inhabit. People are complicated, and so am I. Danny disappeared from the proceedings quickly. Her attorney advised her to cooperate with depositions rather than contest, and she did, giving a careful and measured account in which she claimed to have had no knowledge of the specifics of the codicil and had simply understood it as estate planning Marcus was taking care of. Whether or not that was the truth, it was what she said, and it was said with the composure of someone who had prepared for the question. She and Marcus separated sometime during the litigation. I heard this from Marcus's assistant, who called me once with what I could only describe as a careful offering of information, which I handled with care and documented everything. The settlement was reached 9 months after Harold filed our challenge. I won't give you precise numbers because there are confidentiality provisions attached to parts of it, and I keep my agreements. What I will tell you is this: the 2 transfers were returned, both of them in full. The executor authority in the codicil was vacated, and the original terms reinstated, with Harold as co-executor. The codicil itself was set aside by agreement. Marcus's attorneys pushed for settlement rather than trial, which I believe was because a full trial would have put expert testimony about Gerald's cognitive state on the public record. Testimony that would have followed Marcus professionally for the rest of his career in financial consulting. He issued, through his attorneys, a letter of apology. I read it once. I put it in a folder. I have not opened the folder since. I have not spoken to my son since the morning his calls stopped. People ask me. Everyone asks me, friends. The women I've met through a support group I found 6 months into the litigation. Strangers who have heard parts of this story through the grapevine of small communities, whether I have forgiven him. And I want to give you an honest answer, because I think you deserve one, and because I think dishonest answers to real questions are a kind of small violence. I don't know. I genuinely, truly don't know. Forgiveness feels too large and too specific a word for something I'm still in the middle of. What I have is something more like an ongoing negotiation. With the grief, with the anger, with the love that doesn't go away just because the person attached to it did something that can't be undone. With the possibility that my son is both the boy who shook in the kitchen doorway and the man who stood at the photocopier of an estate planning office in a suburb I'd never heard of and handed his aging father a... People are complicated. I've said that before in this story. I'll probably be saying it for the rest of my life. What I have done, what I can tell you with certainty, is kept living. I got a new phone, which sounds small and is not small because getting a new phone meant accepting that certain things were over and beginning again. I replanted the garden, which had been Gerald's domain, but turns out to be mine too. And this spring it was better than it has ever been, because I finally let myself try things without asking whether Gerald would have done it that way. I finished the book we'd been reading together. I did cry at the end, because I'd told myself I wouldn't, and that's always when it happens. I have breakfast every few weeks with Mrs. Housekeeper, Rosie. She retired from housekeeping after her youngest started college. We go to a diner she likes near her apartment, a place with vinyl booths and menus laminated so many times you can feel the layers. She always orders the same thing. I always order something different. We sit for 2 hours and we talk about everything. Her kids, my garden, the book I'm reading, whatever has happened in the world. We talk about Gerald. She loved him, in the way people love a person they've cared for over years, not romantically, but with the deep knowledge that comes from watching someone live. She knew the way he took his coffee, and the particular look on his face when he was pretending to read but actually napping. She grieved him. She still does. One morning at the diner, about 6 months after the settlement, I asked her, "When you found those papers, that day in the study, did you know right away what it meant, what you were looking at?" She stirred her coffee. She was quiet for a moment, the way she is when she's giving a question the consideration it deserves. "I knew it was wrong," she said finally. "I didn't know the law, I don't know legal things, but I knew wrong when I saw it. I could feel the shape of it." I believed her. I've always believed her. Rosie has never once in 11 years said something she didn't mean. That is what saved me. Not my own cleverness. Not any preparation I'd made, any intuition I'd developed, any advantage I'd had over what was being done to me. I was blind to it. I was grieving and trusting and blind. What saved me was a woman who could feel the shape of wrong, even when she couldn't name all its parts. Who sat with the weight of what she knew for 3 weeks, turning it over every morning, and then put her coat on and stayed 12 minutes past 6 o'clock and told me anyway. I have thought about what might have happened if she hadn't. If she'd done what would have been completely understandable, said nothing, kept her position, avoided the complication of being the person who delivered bad news into a house full of grief. I would have found out eventually. Probably. In a worse way, on a worse timeline, with less left to recover. Or maybe I wouldn't have found out at all. Maybe I would have believed the version Marcus was preparing to tell me. The estate simplification, the streamlining, the arrangement that would have left me with a house and a narrowed life, and a son who called every morning to check in and make sure I was still looking in the right direction. I don't know. I think about it. What I know is this. If you have something you're sitting with, something you witnessed, something you know, something that feels wrong even if you can't name exactly why, the person on the other side of that silence might be sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea they're not drinking, waiting for someone to tell them the truth. And if you're the person at the table, not knowing what you don't know, pay attention to the people who show up. Not the loud ones. Not the ones who make promises in a crisis. The ones who stay 12 minutes past when they should have left. The ones who fold a piece of paper in their pocket and drive home 3 weeks in a row thinking about whether to give it to you, and then finally decide that your knowing matters more than their comfort. Gerald didn't get to finish the book with me. He didn't get to see the garden this spring. He didn't get to know that the bench with the broken slat, the one where they found him, the one I couldn't walk past for months, is now the bench where I sit every evening before the light goes, with my tea and whatever I'm reading, while the garden does its quiet work around me. He didn't get to know how the story ended, but I got to know. I got to end it on my terms, with my house, with my name, with Harold on the phone and Rosie across the diner table, and a garden that is better than it has ever been. And I am still here, which is, I have decided enough, more than enough, everything. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it hit closer to home than you expected, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me if you've ever been in a position like mine, or like Rosie's. Tell me if there's someone in your life you trust the way I trusted, or the way I didn't know I should have trusted differently. I read every comment, every single one, and I respond to as many as I can, because stories like this don't end when the video ends. They keep going in the people who heard them. If this is your first time here, welcome. Every story on this channel is real, in the ways that matter, rooted in the kind of truth that makes your chest tight and your hands still. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I promise you, the next one is just as much. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's in the middle of something they haven't named yet, someone who's at the table with the untouched tea, share this with them. Sometimes people need to hear that other people got through. I'll see you in the next one.